Hi, my name is Nate Dunn, and today we're going to be discussing the topic of recovery. So before we start this presentation, I wanted to begin with kind of the standard definition from science. And the purpose of recovery is to help to manage muscle damage, to help us feel less fatigued, and ultimately to try and make sure that we're adapting to the training that we're trying to adapt to. So now that we've kind of started with that standard definition, let's jump in. So nutrition is a really valuable component of recovery. And you could make the case that perhaps in many cases it's the most important aspect of recovery, but we're actually going to be shelving that topic for a later presentation. And today we're just going to be focusing on some of the different recovery modalities. So even though nutrition plays a massive role in recovery, we're going to be pushing that off to the side and focusing on some of the other pieces. So if you're short on time and you're jumping into this presentation and you're hoping for kind of one quick takeaway, we're actually going to skip to the very end of the presentation. And this is kind of the key takeaway, that if you're really concerned about recovery, if you're really focused on improving your recovery, there's one thing you could do, and that's to pay more attention to how you sleep. And there's a recent book that came out within the last year that does a great job of kind of summarizing some of the most current research on recovery. And this is a quote from that book that really kind of highlights that. And speaking of sleep, it's hands down the most powerful recovery tool known to science. Nothing else comes close. So again, if you're looking for one quick takeaway, focus on your sleep. So the rest of the presentation, we're going to kind of work backwards and kind of give a rationale for how we get there to sleep. But if you're looking for one to take away and run with, that's kind of the punchline today. So we're starting kind of with this focal point of sleeping more. So we're going to kind of move back. And the first thing that we want to focus on is maybe some different training decisions that you might make that can often maybe confuse or conflate your understanding of recovery. So we're going to take a look at that. Then we're going to look at kind of some of the different nature of fatigue, how RPE or rate of perceived exertion can really help to define the recovery strategies that you might choose. So different ways to quantify recovery. And then finally, a handful of the most popular strategies and take a look at whether or not, to what degree that those are effective. And then again, kind of finishing with this punchline of sleep. So this first piece of training, oftentimes, if you're beginning a training program, whether or not that's using an online system or working with a coach, kind of the foundational place that you start is making sure that you're understanding the intensity prescription of that workout plan. So again, whether or not you're working with an online program or with a coach, you want to make sure that the intensity that's been written into those workouts, that you're able to follow those as they've been designed. So this is the power zone system that we use at Data Driven Athlete. So this is something that you can read about in a lot more depth in our cycling workout guide on the website. But it's really important to make sure that if you're doing, let's say, a zone 4 or threshold level workout, that you've kind of calibrated these zones with some fitness testing to make sure that when you get that workout, that you're perhaps maybe not doing that workout at a much greater intensity than it was designed, right? So whether or not that's power zones or whether or not that's utilizing RPE zones, so rate of perceived exertion, a big part of training is kind of moving back and forth between these different zones to make sure that, again, you're following a prescription as it's designed, and that essentially you're not overtraining or training at a much higher intensity as your workouts are designed. So the next piece to kind of pay attention to in your training is programming. And we're going to kind of give an example of this. So this is a standard workout calendar that we have up. Let's say that on a weekend, on a Saturday ride, you've kind of got a typical big ride of 5 hours. On Sunday, you've got a 3-hour ride. You're naturally going to take Monday off for rest. And let's say in your workout plan, you've programmed a really challenging workout to do on Tuesday, maybe a higher intensity workout. Now, for a lot of athletes, this type of programming probably isn't going to set you up to do a really high quality workout on that Tuesday. And so for some people, they might arrive at this Tuesday and they might say, man, my recovery is really kind of lacking. What's the problem? Am I not recovering like I should? And the reality is that the programming of your workouts might not be really allowing for enough time to recover, no matter what your recovery strategy is. So it makes sense to make sure that you're paying attention to your programming, and that the problem maybe is in the programming of your workouts, and maybe it's not your recovery. So kind of another thing to pay attention to. So a couple pieces about training. The next, we're going to pick apart, a little bit the nature of fatigue. So most cyclists are very comfortable, kind of recognizing that we do physical work and that physical work leads to fatigue. So if we have a couple days on the bike, or a long weekend of racing, we expect and we understand that the product of that is fatigue. But what seems to be much more difficult to convince cyclists of is this equally valuable and valid component of fatigue, which is the psychological nature of fatigue. So whether or not you're having a stressful day at work, or different types of stressors in life, that counts as fatigue in the same way that this physical component of fatigue counts. And this is really important when we take a look at recovery strategies, because it's important to note that whether or not it's physical or whether or not it's mental, it's still contributing to fatigue. And there's a lot of research that's that's backed up this idea that you can give an athlete a cognitively demanding exercise, and then give them a subsequent exercise test, and it can have a measurable impact on different elements of performance. So this is a specific paper that showed that it seemed to be that the anaerobic, what we might consider to be the anaerobic component of fitness, declined after a cognitively demanding test exercise. So there's a simple kind of mentally fatiguing exercise they did on the computer. And then in a subsequent fitness test, it showed that classically anaerobic component of fitness declined. So there's a lot more research too that kind of points to this idea. But the take-home message is that physical work is fatiguing, psychological work is fatiguing, and you have to respect that both of those in the same fashion. And that understanding about the nature of fatigue should also obviously play a role in the different recovery strategies that you might pursue. So the primary takeaway is that physical work increases our rate of perceived exertion, and psychological work or stress also increases our rate of perceived exertion. And when we're on the bike doing a task, when that work feels harder, generally that's going to have the outcome of that will be a decline in our performance. So the next one, we want to look at maybe a couple of these different ways, and there's lots of different pieces of technology that have come out, different types of software approaches to try and quantify fatigue. And so we're going to take a look at this section by starting with a recent paper that evaluated the classic objective measures of fatigue. So classically, there are different type of blood markers that people have looked at to try and measure fatigue. And so what this paper did is it looked at those what we consider to be objective measures of fatigue and compared those to subjective measures, right? So that would be measures like RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, or just simply stating how you feel. And what this review paper showed is that these subjective measures actually did a better job of kind of quantifying fatigue, or quantifying how someone feels, than those classically objective measures. So that, again, the take-home message, kind of from however you choose to try and measure your fatigue, our perceptions are reliable, and that should lead us to conclude that investing in further understanding our rate of perceived exertion, or investing in this subjective side of our athlete experience, is really important. And I would make the case that it's more valuable than investing in some of these other objective measures, right? So, the first response to this, especially from me as a coach, as my coaching company being Data Driven Athlete, is, but what about all these different tools that we have to kind of try and quantify fatigue? And so some of those might be heart rate variability, the performance management chart. So different types of software platforms have kind of different flavors on how to do this, but generally that performance management chart tries to model our fatigue, our freshness, and our fitness. Right, so those are some other ways to do it. There's increasingly more devices that in many ways, their sole purpose to kind of try and help us understand our recovery. So the response is, yeah, but what about all these new technologies that can help us, further understand fatigue? And again, I want to kind of go back to this recent book, because it has a great summary here about this. And just to read this quote: "What makes tracking and data analysis so appealing is also what makes it dangerous," right? That it conveys a sense of certainty that the science cannot yet deliver. So again, the take-home message from that is that we have lots of these technologies out there to try and quantify fatigue, to try and quantify our recovery. But right now, there's nothing to suggest that those offer us a greater perspective or greater insight into our recovery or into our fatigue than simple subjective measures, right? So in most of the kind of leading software platforms, there are options after a ride to give it what is called a session RPE, right? So you might give it a rating and say, how hard did this feel, right? So investing in those types of subjective metrics, I would make the case, is still a more valuable component of understanding and quantifying your fatigue and quantifying recovery than relying on some of these other technologies. So if you're really interested in some of these other technologies and to try and quantify recovery, then use those to perhaps calibrate your subjective feelings, but not to supplant them, right? So we're not looking at these devices to just totally take over how we understand recovery, but maybe we start to understand them and see where they can offer insights and also help to calibrate our own feelings. So the last piece here that we're going to move into are different kind of recovery modalities, right? So some of the most popular recovery modalities, massage, recovery boots, electrical muscle stimulation, foam rolling, active recovery, moving back to the recovery boots, also maybe compression stockings, and cold water immersion or CWI. So when you look at all of these different recovery modalities, I think the important thing is to place them in this context. And we've kind of given away the punchline of this presentation. But if we look at all of these different recovery modalities, this is probably a pretty accurate representation of how they should be viewed in context to kind of the biggest, to the biggest piece of the recovery puzzle. And again, to kind of come back to this quote, you could add together every recovery aid ever discovered and they wouldn't stack up to sleep, right? So if you find this unconvincing about the power of sleep, this is a recent book that came out. Now, this book isn't about athletic performance. And so, in the cycling world or in the athlete world, it might not be one of the first ones that we would look at. But if you're looking to kind of learn more, not just about sleep and how it might impact recovery, but also about how it impacts life and societal structures as well, I found this book to be very compelling. No matter how much messaging you've heard about how important sleep is, this is a very convincing book to say, I know that you think this is important, but it's actually really, really, really important. So if you're needing a little bit more convincing in this regard, this is a great resource to kind of learn more about the function of sleep. All right, so we understand how important sleep is. Why then do most athletes still stand here looking at these different recovery modalities and give all their focus to some of these lesser or marginal recovery strategies? And I think part of this is, cyclists over the past 10 years have gotten very comfortable with this idea of marginal gains, and that is that we can aggregate these smaller gains, and if we put those all together, they can actually translate into much bigger or much larger gains. And I think that's true, but it's important to put that into context that, pro cyclists and the best cyclists in the world, they pursue marginal gains precisely because they've exhausted maximal gains, right? So the best cyclists or the best athletes in the world, they're not hyper-focused on these small strategies. This does not form the core of their recovery, their approach to recovery. They're maximizing things like sleep, and only then, after they've maximized kind of those big rocks in their recovery, in their recovery bowl, are they then perhaps experimenting with some of these smaller or marginal training strategies. So it's important, again, to put this in context that if you are committed to recovery and improving your cycling, it's hard to make the case that you are really committed to that if you're not first placing sleep in the bowl and then maybe seeing where some of these other ones fit kind of after that. So in terms of sleeping well, I'm not a sleep scientist. This isn't my area of study or expertise, but these are some things I've learned that have really helped me. Or when I experience that I'm sleeping well or not as well, I've kind of found that these are some of the keys. And the first one is to identify points of overwhelm in life, right? And this kind of goes back to the nature of fatigue that we talked about a little bit earlier. But when I can identify those points of overwhelm or stress in my life and address those and bring more organization and bring more structure to those, I found that those often have, that when I can do that, my sleep is often improved. So the next one, again, we're not going to run down the list of these. You can find these online, but examining kind of your sleep hygiene, and this is another one of those buzzwords that have become more popular in the last couple of years, but things like keeping your phone out of your room and choosing to not be on electronic devices after a certain time, all those types of things. So again, we're not going to jump into that, but making sure that you're kind of working through a list like that to improve the conditions in your room in which you're sleeping can also have a big impact. And the last one here is to accept compromise, and that is that it's not going to be possible to watch every show you want to watch on Netflix, to stay up late at night, to eat whatever you want late at night, and to also sleep well. It's just not going to be possible. So again, to rewind the tape a little bit, if you are interested in improving your recovery and you accept that sleep is an important part of that, you're going to have to accept some compromises, and that might be shuffling around some responsibilities in the evening to ensure that you can get in your room and start that process of winding down. So it's important that, again, when we look at recovery, when we look at enhancing recovery, I think most of us are drawn to some of these marginal strategies like massage or like, compression boots, because they don't force us to make a compromise, right? So we look at those and we say, oh, I like those. I want to believe that those work and that those are effective because they don't demand a compromise of our life. But sleep is one of those that requires systems change to really help to improve our sleep. And that anytime we're trying to change something as big as sleep or change systems of our life, it demands a compromise from us. And so, we kind of need to address that up front. So if you're committed, again, to kind of systems change or to maybe, making some big changes in your life, this is another book that is not related to cycling. There's a little bit about cycling in this book, but it has nothing to do with cycling. It's all about kind of changing habits and changing systems in your life to get better outcomes. And obviously in this case, we're talking about sleep. So another phenomenal book where if you're looking to make some changes in your life with an eye towards improving your sleep, this is a book, one of the best books I've read that relates to cycling and that can impact your cycling. So again, we're going to kind of run through a quick review of what we've covered today. First of all, don't conflate training decisions with inadequate recovery. So we talked about that in terms of ensuring that the intensity with which you're executing your workouts lines up with the prescription that you're following, and also as well as the programming of your workouts to make sure that they're giving you opportunity to get adequate recovery. So number 2, understand the psychological component of fatigue. We recognize that fatigue has a physical component, but all of those other pieces of stress also drive fatigue and also can impair our recovery. And conversely, you can have really effective recovery strategies that have nothing to do with physical rest, but have everything to do with perhaps disconnecting from stress, putting yourself in another environment where you're not feeling and experiencing that stress. It's important to make sure that you're investing in your rate of perceived exertion and becoming further attuned with kind of the subjective experience of what fatigue feels like and what recovery feels like. And then you can use some of that other stuff, some of those other new technologies to maybe help to calibrate those feelings, but anchor that understanding in your subjective experience. Focus on the maximal, not marginal recovery strategies, right? So again, it's going to require some compromise on your part, but if you're really interested in improving your recovery, we want to focus on maximal. And there's nothing more maximal when it comes to recovery than sleep. And finally, obviously, if we're going to take on something big like sleep, it's going to evaluate a change in systems, right? It's not like we're sitting down on the couch and putting some recovery boots on and watching Netflix. That's easy. That accepts zero compromise. That requires zero compromise. When it comes to sleep, it will come with compromise, and it will have to require some systems changes. But again, if you're committed to recovery, then that's what it looks like. So I hope you found this presentation helpful. Excited about having many more to come about various topics related to your cycling. Thanks.